Michal Meidan, head of China Research Program at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. Michal, where is China in all of this? We've seen incredible continued trade surplus numbers through the first quarter, something like $250 billion trade surplus. China's racking up, selling all their stuff to the world. Where's China on this war at this stage? A lot of noise in the last week or so that behind the scenes they were throwing their weight around. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, hi, Sean. I mean, Q1 data still doesn't really reflect the Iran war, right? That's sort of the build up to the war. So we've had pretty good results. We also have to bear in mind that Q1 is Chinese Lunar New Year, so the data is always a bit skewed. You have a strong Jan, then February activity calms down a bit during the Lunar New Year, and then we had a build up actually of refineries towards maintenance, ahead of maintenance that has now sort of been imposed upon some of them and delayed by others. So Q1 data doesn't tell us that much just yet. We'll have to see April data. But I think it's a sort of a tale of two Chinas, right? Because on the one hand, they are hugely exposed to the disruptions through Hormuz. 40% of oil, 40 to 45% of petrochemical feedstocks, 27% of their LNG comes from Qatar. But then it's the compounding impacts of all of these outages, especially on the petrochemical industry and the price increases. Concern about what's going to happen to the global economy because, as you just said, they are dependent on exports, and even though clean tech is doing really well, the rest of it could get hit by a weaker economic outlook. So that's a concern. That said, they have huge shock absorbers for this crisis, right? They've got oil stocks that I think they're now going to start to gradually release. They've got an energy system that is domestically quite robust and diversified with a lot of coal and renewables. So they have shock absorbers, they've got buffers in the system, but they're by no means complacent because the big question is how long does it last and sort of what does it look like even with this nominal ceasefire?
The if we look at the again the sort of the Chinese posture here, there seems to be sort of two different views emerging. One, that the Chinese are going to get increasingly irritated by the Iranian position vis-a-vis sustaining the Strait of Hormuz disruption, which of course they are one of the biggest victims of, in the sense that they are one of the biggest energy importers from the Gulf. America is not. Or the other is that no, the opposite, that they're happy to see the Western allies sort of bogged down in another crisis and so forth. Where do you think the China position is with this, and particularly looking at it from the perspective of going into this big summit between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump next month?
I mean, to the extent that it's possible, there's a mix of both, right? I mean, there's a lot of frustration. I would say more with the US than with the Iranians. I do think that they view the Iranian response as, I don't know if legitimate, but a response to US and Israeli attacks. Um, but it's obviously, as you were saying, hurting their interests and something that they would like to control. Whatever flows are flowing, sort of whatever is going out of the Gulf is still going to China. So we saw, at least in March, that there was Iranian crude going to China. And I think the priority is to try and maintain that. We have heard that they've put some pressure on the Iranians to come to the negotiating table and try and resolve this. Um, a huge amount of frustration, therefore, with all sides and just with the war in general and with the disruption and the upheaval. I think it is premature to say that they are sort of that they win or that they're happy. Yes, it's good to have the US move military assets away from Asia. Yes, it's good for sort of that, the kind of rhetoric about the US and the West's decline. But that decline is pretty painful for China as well, again, to the extent that it is impacting its interest, the global economy. So I don't think, anybody's doing a jig right now in Beijing. Long term, this probably serves China's global interest. But the other thing, right, that the decline of the US, if there is a decline, it is coming with the unraveling of a lot of multilateral and global institutions that China has rallied against and it's, sort of decried, but it has benefited from them. Even, both the WTO and the economic growth, but also just to be able to position itself as an alternative to those mechanisms and institutions was something quite favorable for China. With those gone, then it's mayhem. And China's not willing or ready to take any kind of leadership position or role right now globally. Yes, it's willing to play a role behind the scenes and trying to mediate, but it's a very tricky balance here, especially with the US being.
Would one be sort of getting over one's skis by saying that they have a greater ability to influence Iran or not?
I think they have a huge amount of leverage over Iran, but do they have leverage over the US and Israel? And are they willing to exercise to use it right now? And I do think that the priority is getting the Xi Trump meeting next month, but that is so up in the air, right? Because 2 weeks ago they were helpful mediating. Last week, the Trump administration came out and said, don't sell any more weapons to the Iranians or we're going to slap tariffs on you. And now you're being uncooperative. So it's this sort of, it's impossible, right? They can't win to a certain degree with the US. And so I think they're trying to navigate that. Um, and it's very, very tricky. But the priority remains trying to get the Xi Trump meeting.
The priority for China, that
Yes.
keeping that on track is something of importance to them.
Absolutely, because they hope to get to, some stabilization of tariffs, maybe some kind of language around Taiwan, but that's really what they're hoping for because that is the key to, well, at least hopefully the key to stabilizing bilateral relations and economic growth. But it's been quite phenomenal how they've tried to keep that bilateral track steady when it feels like, around it everything is going crazy and blowing up both literally and figuratively. And yet that bilateral track, they're trying really hard to maintain it.
Mikhail, just looking at the Chinese sort of interaction here of their ability to coordinate the neighborhood. I mean, the language of Trump, even though we're in a phase in which his languages and his actions and the U.S. administration's actions are, full engagement. Militarily, there's an armada in the neighborhood, but the sort of more long term language is we want to get out of here. The Strait of Hormuz is not our problem. NATO, sort out your own mess. Europe, defend yourself. We're not going to keep paying for everybody's security on the high seas here and the shipping lanes and so forth. I'm wondering where you see the follow through of that from the point of view of China's interpretation of all of that. Because of course they do depend heavily of the high seas. They are the world's biggest exporter. They are the biggest importer of energy, of oil, and so forth. This withdrawal language versus China's interpretation of it.
I think it's something that, they are concerned about, although we're not seeing it, right? And Trump said no more wars, and he's back in a very big war. Hugely concerning, but not something that the Chinese are willing to step up and take more action and activity in. I do think that despite that heavy exposure, the Middle East is not a core interest for China. And it is, and they've long seen it as a really interesting observation ground for military tactics and innovation, but it is where empires go to die, essentially. And they're not going to get more actively militarily involved. I think there is pressure domestically. At the start of the war, you had Chinese shippers saying on sort of WeChat groups and others, why is our Navy not stepping in? Why is China not becoming, we're a big power. But that is pressure that I think the Chinese government wants to resist now. If you remember Libya 15 years ago, there was the big airlifting of a lot of Chinese people, and that was sort of seen as China's big stepping out moment. Domestically, it was criticized because it was a dangerous precedent that the Chinese weren't sure that they wanted to keep. That to them, if there is any lesson from the US, it is not to get overexposed prematurely. Domestically, there's a lot of reshuffling within the military. So something that they're watching with concern, but I think, when they talk about in the 15th five-year plan about a world of strategic threat and a really negative external environment, that's part of it, but not something that China's going to be willing to step in and shoulder that responsibility. It's too costly.